Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stripping away the romantic mythology of 19th century exploration to look at a literal textbook case of Victorian arrogance and, frankly, catastrophic failure. We're examining the legendary 1845 Franklin expedition. This was a mission to find the Northwest Passage that ended with all 129 men dead in the frozen Arctic. But as we'll see today, this wasn't just a tragic defeat by Mother Nature. Actually, scratch that. It was a highly preventable disaster, driven by the lowest bidder, an empire's massive ego, and just some deeply, deeply flawed decision-making.
Now, to really grasp just how bad things got out there, let's look at a chilling discovery from September 2024. Using modern DNA technology, scientists finally identified the remains of James Fitzjames, the captain of the HMS Erebus. But you see, they didn't find a neatly buried hero. They found parts of a defleshed jawbone covered in knife cuts. Someone had literally carved the flesh right off his bone. This forensic evidence proved what Victorian England spent decades desperately trying to deny: the expedition's horrific descent into starvation and, ultimately, cannibalism. So how did the absolute pinnacle of the British Royal Navy end up eating their own captains?
Okay, let's dive into this. And it all starts right at the top with leadership. Look at the stark contrast we have here. On one hand, you've got Francis Crozier, highly experienced in the ice, but overlooked for the top job simply because he was Irish. You also have James Fitzjames, an absolute rising star in the Navy, but rejected for command because, at 32, he was deemed too young. So who did the Admiralty choose instead? Sir John Franklin. I mean, the guy was 59 years old, which was practically retirement age back then. Plus, he was already famous from a previous Arctic disaster where 11 of his men died, and the survivors only made it by eating lichen on their own leather footwear. He was literally known as the man who ate his boots. Let that sink in. The British elite chose a man famous for nearly starving to death over actual, qualified experts.
And this arrogance completely blinded them to the realities of surviving in minus 50 degrees Celsius temperatures. Just look at their expedition priorities. They were sailing into an unpredictable, multi-year ice trap, but they packed their two reinforced ships, the Erebus and Terror, like they were going on a luxury Caribbean cruise. Instead of prioritizing practical survival gear or cold weather training, Lady Jane Franklin, John's wife, packed over 1,000 books so the men wouldn't get bored. They brought heavy silver tableware, delicate silk scarves, a dog, a cat, and, incredibly, I cannot make this up, a pet monkey. It is a staggering delusion of what this environment actually demanded. But while they were busy packing monkeys and silver spoons, they cut corners on the one thing that actually mattered: the food. 8,000. That is the massive number of meat cans an entirely unknown supplier named Stephen Goldner had to furiously rush produce in just 7 weeks for the 129-man crew. And why did the Admiralty choose Goldner? One simple reason: he was the lowest bidder. He rushed production to meet the deadline, and as we're going to see, that single act of corporate negligence sealed the crew's fate before they even left port.
So the crucial point here is that the true villain of this explainer isn't just the freezing weather, it's lead. Goldner sealed those 8,000 rushed cans with cheap lead solder that actively leached directly into the meat. On top of that, the ship's internal water pipes, also made of lead. The men were cooking with it, drinking it, and eating it every single day. This toxic buildup slowly, silently destroyed their immunity, caused agonizing pain in their limbs, and induced extreme mental confusion. Let's move to and see how this builds across a truly horrifying forensic timeline, especially once Franklin sailed them directly into an inescapable frozen trap near King William Island. By 1845, the ships are stuck. Fast forward to the winter of 1846 and another disaster strikes. Their massive supply of lemon juice, which was meant to prevent scurvy, began to ferment. So to save it, they boiled it, unknowingly destroying all the vitamin C. Absolute disaster. In June 1847, Sir John Franklin dies. Finally, in April 1848, the 105 desperate, starving survivors decide to abandon their heavily stocked ships and try to walk out across the ice. But before we follow them out onto the ice, take a second to look at the perfect storm of physiological failure that was ravaging their bodies. We know all of this from modern autopsies done on sailors who died early on and were buried in the permafrost. These guys were suffering from severe lead poisoning. Scurvy was making their teeth fall out and causing their old, healed wounds to literally reopen. Because their immune systems were completely shot, tuberculosis and pneumonia just ran rampant through the crew. And finally, starvation set in, as their poorly sealed canned foods spoiled, leaving them to starve in a pitch-black, minus 50-degree wasteland.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the evidence of their completely collapsing minds.
When modern searchers later found the crew's remains, they discovered a notebook filled with encrypted backward writing, featuring this incredibly morbid quote, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" spiraling right around the words "Camp of Horror empty." This lead-induced delirium explains their final fatal decisions on the ice. They loaded 350-kilogram lifeboats onto sleds. But instead of just packing food, these dying men dragged fragrant soap, 18 kilograms of chocolate, light boots, and silk scarves. They exhausted their final precious calories dragging Victorian luxury goods across a frozen hellscape.
So in 1854, an explorer named Dr. John Ray finally learns the truth. He spoke to the local Inuit, who reported seeing white men dragging boats, starving, and eventually cooking and eating each other. When Ray brought this horrific news back to London, Victorian society completely panicked. Lady Jane Franklin, who was desperate to protect her husband's hero status, enlisted the help of her powerful friend, the famous author Charles Dickens. Dickens launched a massive propaganda smear campaign, writing, "Surely you don't believe English gentlemen could do something like this." They branded the Inuit as liars, flat out refusing to accept that polite, refined British officers would ever resort to cannibalism. The British Admiralty was so desperate to control the narrative and find the missing ships that they offered a £20,000 reward. To put that into perspective, that is roughly £2 million today. This sparked decades of frantic, totally failed rescue missions. Dozens of ships scoured the Arctic, and several of those rescue ships ended up getting crushed and abandoned in the ice themselves. And through it all, they actively ignored the indigenous people who possessed the exact geographical knowledge of where the ships and the bodies actually were. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate cost of that colonial hubris. Look at this chart. During the massive, frantic searches between 1848 and 1880, acting purely on British naval assumptions, 0 ships were found. 0. Fast forward to 2014 and 2016. Modern searchers finally teamed up with Louis Komokak, an Inuit historian who had spent his entire life studying his people's oral histories. By simply listening to the generations of Inuit knowledge that the Victorians had arrogantly dismissed, they found exactly what they were looking for, both the Erebus and the Terror, incredibly well preserved beneath the ice. 2 ships found, purely by dropping the ego and listening. Which brings us to the ultimate icy irony, the legendary Northwest Passage. This exact route that swallowed 129 men and fueled over a century of mystery is now a modern tourist destination, thanks to retreating permafrost and changing climates. In 2016, a massive cruise ship carrying 1,000 passengers casually navigated these exact same waters. And in 2023, 4 guys calling themselves the Arctic Cowboys actually paddled Franklin's route in ordinary human-powered kayaks. They survived the whole trip, only to be promptly arrested by Canadian authorities for trespassing in restricted zones. You really can't make it up. So what does this all mean? What should you take away from this? The Franklin expedition is so often framed as a romantic tragedy of man versus the harsh elements. But as we've explored today, it was anything but. Between the low, bitter, lead-poisoned cans, the absurd appointment of an aging boot-eater over qualified leaders, the downright delusional packing lists, and a decades-long media cover-up, the real killer wasn't just the cold, it was hubris. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Next time you hear a story about brave explorers defeated by the terrifying unknown, ask yourself, were they really victims of a grand mystery, or just casualties of corporate negligence and a total refusal to listen to the people who actually knew the way? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the narrative, and I'll catch you next time.